Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for this really exciting talk. My name is Al-Mutanabi. I'm an affiliated scholar here at the Islamization Institute, and it's a pleasure to be moderating the talk today by Professor Zahra Ali. I had the pleasure of actually moderating her panel. We have to stop meeting like this, Zahra, at the Middle East Studies Association conference in New Orleans, which was also a fantastic talk there. So I'm excited to hear more about the book, which is excellent. First off, just want to thank the Women and Gender Studies program, particularly Rima Majid and Sara Murad, for helping to organize and leading on organizing this talk, and also folks at IFI here, Rayan Al-Amin and Sareen Karajarjian. And I will just introduce Zahra. She's going to speak for about an hour or so, and then we're going to do questions and answers. So the event is about 2 hours, so we're going to go till 5. So Zahra Ali is a sociologist and assistant professor of sociology at Rutgers University in New Jersey. Her research explores dynamics of women and gender, social and political movements in relation to Islam or Islam's plural, the Middle East, and context of war and conflict with a focus on contemporary Iraq. She's also interested in post-coloniality, decolonial feminisms, and epistemologies. And her book, I'm sure you saw the description, but I'm going to read it out really kind of quickly just to contextualize the talk, which is about the book, Women and Gender in Iraq, Between Nation Building and Fragmentation, published in 2018 with Cambridge University Press, as a sociological study of Iraqi women's social, political activism and feminisms through an in-depth ethnography of post-2003 Iraqi women's rights organizations and a detailed research on Iraqi women's social, economic, and political experiences since the formation of the Iraqi state. Through a transnational, post-colonial feminist approach, Zahra looks at the ways in which gender norms and practices, Iraqi feminist discourses and activisms are shaped and developed through state politics, competing nationalisms, religious, tribal, and sectarian dynamics, as well as wars and economic sanctions. She particularly looks at the context following the US-led invasion and occupation of the country in 2003, and analyzes the realities of Iraqi women's lives, political activism, and feminisms, especially the challenges posed by sectarianism and militarism. I should just add, before I throw it over to you, I would be remiss not to mention that Iraq continues to be in the throes of a prolonged revolution, now 5 months almost into continued protests, demonstrations, and revolutionary activity. Protesters would certainly call it that, and that continues through today, and so does the counter-revolutionary forces that continue to deploy vicious and unprecedented violence against protesters, killing them in the hundreds and injuring them in the tens of thousands. And the most recent creative form of violence against peaceful protesters has been the usage just this week of hunting weapons, pellets being shot at protesters. And I have no doubt that Zahra will be speaking about this moment in her talk. So we are excited, and we are certainly in solidarity with you and your work, and you are among friends here. So thank you for joining us. And Zahra, I throw it to you.
Thank you so much, Omar. Can you hear me? Yeah. Thanks. Thank you so much to the Islamization Institute and the Women in Gender Studies initiative. Thanks very much, Rima Majid, for inviting me. Thank you, Sare, Sareen, all the organizers. I'm so happy to be here. It's been a while that I haven't been in Beirut, actually. And it means really a lot to me to be here, because I really feel that our contexts are not only comparable, but our contexts and perhaps also our lives are connected and related, right? So it makes really a lot of sense for me to present something on Iraq with, in light with what is going on here and there. So I'm gonna start this talk about my book in the same way I start my book, actually, with a description of my everyday life in Iraq, more specifically in Baghdad, and some fieldwork observation, just to give you a little bit of kind of a picture. As you might know, and you also familiar with such realities, Baghdad is really segmented by checkpoints and concrete walls that divide its neighborhood according to sectarian belongings. Such barriers also exist around governmental buildings and also specifically surrounding the Green Zone, where some of the country's most important institutions, the parliament, the Council of Ministries, as well as the biggest US embassy in the world, are situated. And of course, many of these walls are covered with paintings of the Iraqi flag, scenes highlighting national unity and various symbols of ancient and modern Iraq. These artworks hardly affect the atmosphere of conflict, the atmosphere of unspeakable degradation and impoverishment. On my way to central Baghdad, when I was conducting fieldwork, from Al-Kadhmiya, which is a neighborhood where my family live and where I live when I'm in Iraq, you will see marks of bullets, explosions, hanging electricity wires and dirt. I always witness heartbreaking scenes of women beggars, often holding a swaddled baby in their arms. They would sit in the dust, wearing a ripped black abaya, or stand, selling small packets of tissues to car drivers. Next to them, children whose faces have been burned by the sun sell all kinds of biscuits, sweets, and small bottles of water. And when you approach central Baghdad, you will approach Al-Rashid Street and Nahar Street. And today, these streets have been converted into depositories and wholesale shops for all kinds of projects. Whereas before, this area of Baghdad used to be the cultural and social heart of the city. This area was full of theaters, cinemas, shops, cafes, restaurants, and places for young Baghdadis to relax, socialize, and walk around. Now, the beautifully white and flowery balconies and colonnades are covered in dirt, and the theaters, cinemas, and cafes have disappeared. When I was living in Baghdad, I used to visit, maybe some of you actually have visited Al-Mutanabi area. And I used to visit it almost on a weekly basis. And Friday is the day this street, which is dedicated to books and stationery, unveils its treasures and wonders. Booksellers display their books along the street as scholars and students of all fields, poets, musicians, writers, painters, political activists, and idealists of all ages walk along. Al-Mutanabi is the only street in central Baghdad that has been fully, or partly, let's say, refurbished. It was nearly destroyed in 2007 after a dramatic car bomb killed 30 people and wounded 100. And in the little garden at the end of the street, around Al-Qishla clock tower, on the edge of the Tigris River, a group of musicians often sits at a wooden kiosk, singing all Iraqi songs and playing maqam with their ouds, while others improvise verses of poetry. There are not so many women, young or old, working around in this area nowadays. Middle-aged or older academic and other highly educated men are in the majority. Most of the women I meet, apart from activists and scholars with whom I had a specific appointment, were mothers who came to buy school books for their children. And sadly, apart from small little islands like Al-Mutanabi and university campuses, and I will talk about it at the end of the talk, like Tahrir Square and all the squares of protest all over the country, most outside public spaces in Baghdad are male-dominated, particularly by young and middle-aged army soldiers or police officers, or widows begging in tattered black abayas are the primary female figures in the street. Outdoor places where women can spend some spare time and walk around are places of consumptions, such as markets, restaurants, cafes, ice cream shops, malls, and some of Baghdad's middle and upper class clubs. The possibility of access to these spaces are related to belonging to the middle or upper class and making visible this affiliation through appropriate dress code and the ability to buy and consume. Most well-known outdoor places where women can stay at ease necessitate a certain social status and economic capital. And clearly, private clubs such as Nadi Said in Al-Mansour area or Nadi Al-Alwi in central Baghdad are open to upper-class Iraqis and seek to preserve this class hierarchy through the membership and consumption prices. Shopping malls that my colleague Omar Sirri also study are not as hierarchical as they are in principle open to all, but Baghdadis do dress up to go to Mall al-Mansour, for example, or having a tea or coffee. There is actually 3 times more expensive than outside of the mall. So this is a picture of the mall. So it is essential for me to start this talk with a description of what I would call the everyday. Okay, because it is one of the main, oh, now I see the difference. Because it is one of the main theoretical and I would say also political proposition that my book is making. And I will put this picture because this picture was actually the picture that I wanted for the cover of my book, but it was refused by the publisher, so I will leave it here for a moment. Because really, until recently, and until I think to the exception of some work, such as Omar's work and Rime's work and other very recent work, I think that Iraq has been a topic for so many. It is a context on which many political scientists, especially, and scholars have built their career to speak about conflict, to speak about sectarianism, to speak about Islamism, but also to talk about very important topics such as imperialism, US invasion, etc. And while I don't think this is irrelevant, I think it is limited, and that often the ones that are missing from the picture are Iraqis themselves, their everyday life, their everyday realities. So not only the literature on Iraq has a predominant white men political scientist lens, but even the scholarship written by Iraqi intellectuals from the diaspora is often authored by the older generation, and more importantly, it is disconnected from the realities, the social and political dynamics existing inside the country. So many Iraqis and non-Iraqis actually talk about Iraq as something very much in their mind, without being in touch or leaving or visiting even the country. So I wanted to focus on the point of view of the everyday, meaning how I started my research is really trying to let the categories emerge from the everyday life, the everyday ethnographic observation, rather than come up or start a research with pre-thought categories. This is kind of the methodological proposition of the book. And the second proposition is that, well, I guess some people now are realizing, since we are experiencing a revolution, Iraq did not end in 2003. And I really wanted to add to the point of view of the everyday a longer historical approach than the one focusing on post-2003. There's really an over-focus on post-2003 without a care for the continuity of history, especially if you think about what happened since the 90s. So my book actually took the challenge to start with the very formation of the Iraqi state in the 1920s. So I often describe this book as her story of Iraq as opposed to a his story of Iraq, because the book relies primarily on the point of view of women, more precisely women activists. It relies on an in-depth ethnography of women's social and political group throughout a period of several years. mostly in Baghdad, but also I conducted fieldwork in Iraqi Kurdistan in the cities of Erbil and Slaymaniyah. And more recently, I conducted fieldwork in Najaf, Kufa, Karbala, and Nasiriyah. And it really relies on life stories, interviews of over 100 women from all social, political, ethnic, religious, and sectarian backgrounds. So I started every single interview with the woman activist with a simple question. شنو اللي خلاك تكوني ناشطة نسوية? What made you become a woman activist or a feminist? And then I listened for hours, and I followed the activists for months, and for some of them for years. And from the hours of conversation aroused by this question, I've gathered in this book a transgenerational oral history of women's social, economic, intellectual, and political lives since at least the 1950s. And I often say that this book is as much about women, gender, and feminisms in Iraq that it is a feminist book about Iraq. Because I'm trying to apply the personal is political feminist mantra, not only in looking at what Iraqi women's social and political activists say or think, but at the very concrete social, economic, and political context that shape their discourse and activism. So I'm really trying to apply the personal is political analytically. So because what I noticed is that a lot of the work on women and gender in post-colonial context, in the Middle East in particular, focus very much on discourses and representations, on really the discursive dimension of women's life. So I really wanted to rather focus, or not even rather, but to merge discourses with the materiality of the everyday life. So, so my approach is very relational. Some would call it intersectional. I was inspired very much by Ella Shohat's idea of dialogical encounters of differences that define relational analysis that would address the operative terms and axes of stratification typical of specific contexts, along with the ways these terms and stratifications are translated as they travel from one context to another. So the idea is to look at different positioning vis-à-vis histories of power and showing the co-implicated histories and communities rather than talk about an East or a West. And when we think of the words feminism, women's rights, I think that it is very essential to complicate the local versus global simplistic dichotomy, showing, for example, that what is perceived as global is often very specific. When we think, for example, of global feminism, it is often a very Eurocentric, middle-class and neoliberal approach of the rights and the needs of the so-called women of the world. Critical feminist approach really, that I'm trying to engage with, question the category woman and the notion of sisterhood in many different contexts. And often what is perceived as local is the result of transnational, regional dynamics. So I try in the book to apply this critical feminist perspective as a method. And this is why ethnography, again, is so central. Through the ethnographic moments in the book, through what I'm saying is basically describing the place, the space is in the environment where the interview takes place is as important as the content of the interview itself. And I also echo an author that I'm pretty sure some of you are familiar with, this idea developed by Lala Abu Lughot called, writing against culture, right? So this idea that we need to unpack what we mean by culture. And I'm saying that not only in addressing Orientalist or Western views on the Middle East, but I think that as feminists and also as activists in my interviews, when I hear our culture refuses that, or this is no, هاي ثقافتنا, we can't touch it. So I try to complicate the debate around culture and actually avoid the term culture, analytically I mean. And I also try to complicate the debates on words such as Islamic, Muslim, Islamist. And among the many things I'm trying to challenge, I question certain dichotomies and assumed oppositions, such as the secular versus the religious opposition, especially when it comes to women's rights and gender issues. I show it very clearly and concretely, I hope, that the so-called secular and Islamist activists are their activism and them as person as diverse. Their registers of advocacy and activism are intertwined, and that often these terms are not relevant to make sense of a political activism. And I argue that when we contextualize and when we historicize different forms of women's social and political activism and feminisms, the use of different registers of rights, imaginaries, frames of references on notion of justice, dignity, equality are imbricated, and really it doesn't make any sense to make them fall into the secular or the religious or Islamist category. And I'm also challenging the secular religious binary through transnational feminist critique that argues that we need not only to apply a relational approach in imbricating issues of gender with class, ethnicity, religion, sex, kinship, different forms of belonging, but also that we need to keep in mind and analyze the ways the categories themselves are fluid and changing. So what I'm trying to do in the book is to analyze the imbrication between issues of nationhood, nationalism, state politics, religion, and gender, and how this imbrication is played, composed, articulated, intertwined in different periods of time from the formulation of the woman question, right, in the early post-colonial period to today. What are the terms of this imbrication in the early Iraqi Republic, under the Ba'ath regime in the 70s, under the Ba'ath regime in the 80s and 90s, and then after 2003? So now I'll give you kind of an overview of the book, which is a really tough job. But I'm going to summarize very quickly my argument. So the book is built historically. I start chronologically, I start with the early post-colonial period, and I show how women and gender issues were shaped by different power struggles involving competing ideas of nationhood and definition of the state, and struggle between social and political forces. Basically my argument in relation to the early post-colonial, colonial and early post-colonial area is that basically the British tribalized woman, and I show it in different ways. Then I really spent some time analyzing the importance of the revolutionary period, which is 1958 to 1963, and I gathered a lot of oral history about this period. And specifically because it is the period of the codification or the establishment of the personal status code that most of you know is the legal frame gathering most of women's legal rights in terms of marriage, inheritance, divorce, etc. And what I show in this chapter on this period is that the personal status code was really, its establishment, at the time it was considered as one of the most progressive in the region. Even in terms of issues of inheritance, we didn't reach equality, but in certain cases of agricultural lands, the personal status code actually granted equality. And so the way I try to analyze it is also to show, to discuss the different trends of feminism existing in Iraq in the 50s and the 60s. Like in the region, let's say that the two main trends were the communist feminists and the nationalist feminists. In the case of Iraq, the communist feminists, or more, I would say, the leftist trend of feminism, was really the dominant trend. And we can definitely say that until perhaps the mid-70s, or even, let's say, the beginning of the 80s, the dominant political kind of culture in Iraq was the culture of the anti-imperialist left. And this, of course, shaped the ways in which women's rights issues and feminist activism was deployed. And so the personal status code, it's important to understand it, gathers both Sunni and Shia jurisprudence, right? So at the time, it was, of course, an object of negotiation between feminist activists who participating to its drafting. Somebody that perhaps you heard of, Naziha Delaimi, who was the first Arab minister, and she was a minister of the municipalities, and she participated in drafting the personal status code, and she was a member of the Communist Party and a figure of Rabitat al-Mar'a al-Iraqiyya, the League of Iraqi Women, the main organization. So it was really the symbol of kind of the post-colonial negotiation around issues of Islamic, so-called, of course, Islamic authenticity, and also this idea that this new republic needs to symbolize progress, etc. And really the fact that the personal status code unites Sunni and Shia jurisprudence is really something that was considered as very, very important at the time. And more generally, if you follow, and I kind of try to do it also in the book, if you follow the evolution of the personal status code in Iraq and elsewhere, if you look at the ways in which it was reformed and re-reformed, you can really follow how issues of gender, issues of state politics, issues of nationhood and various ideologies and the general economic and social context of the country is evolving and is played on women's rights. So then I talk in the book about the Ba'ath period, and I analyze the relationship between gender issues with issues of authoritarianism, state rentierism, tribalism, and Islamism. And really the conversation is about structural violence versus political violence. How can we analyze feminism within the context of authoritarianism? What kind of feminism do you have in such context? And I mean, I'll go quickly because I can't really go into details, but let's say that gender politics during the 1970s in Iraq were characterized by economic, social, and cultural growth, incited by oil wealth that helped to enhance women's life conditions and legal rights. So this period is very often by Iraqis themselves considered as the golden age. But this period, I mean, the Ba'ath regime itself completely shifted from a kind of secular, let's say, pro-women, nationalist, socialist kind of discourse to a more conservative discourse after the war with Iran. And really, we see the impact very clearly of the militarization of the Iraqi society in gender politics. And the personal status code was reformed let's say, in a more conservative way at the time. But really the most profound changes were provoked by what is called what we call the Gulf War, what I would call I mean, the US-led incredible bombing of Iraq, of all kinds of civilian infrastructures. There's a UN report that was published afterwards that describe the impact of the bombing as Iraq turning from a modern, advanced industrial country to a country in the pre-industrial age. So this is just to give you an idea. And following, of course, the war, the terrible sanctions imposed on Iraq that really deeply altered its social fabric. In the book, I interview a lot of women who tell me how ordinary Iraqis survived the sanction, how the sanctions really redefined the social fabric of society, how new forms of patriarchy emerge when the society, the everyday life is about survival. So in a period of generalized impoverishment, social and political conservatism really redefined women's lives and gender norms and practices, really towards the loss of social and political status. People tend to forget that it's under Saddam Hussein regime that a mahram for women to travel was imposed. So this is kind of the shift. It's the same regime that granted incredible rights in the personal status code in the 70s and then will impose a mahram for women to travel in the 90s. And I also talk a lot about Al-Hamla Al-Imaniya, the FACE campaign that was launched by the regime. So really, when you look more deeply at the historical development, you really understand very quickly that what we have been experiencing after 2003 is only the exacerbation, right, of a process of social, political fragmentation that really started in the 90s. And really, I think that the post-2003 context just shaped, exacerbated this situation and shaped it in the form of identity politics. As you know, and you're familiar with identity and sectarian politics in this country, but what happened in Iraq is that after 2003, the US administration, it's really for the first time in Iraq's history that communal identity, sectarian, ethnic, religious, was institutionalized as part of the political system itself. So to be a representative or exist politically, you need to be a Sunni or Shi'i or an Arab or a Kurd or and not, for example, a nationalist or communist, etc. And this really plunged the country into generalized violence, in addition, of course, to the war, the occupation itself, and the dysfunctional and corrupt political system that was put in place really shaped what we are experiencing today. The country really needed its infrastructures and institutions to be reconstructed. It needed everything, right? From sewage system, from water and electricity infrastructures, housing, the rebuilding of its health and education system that used to be one of the best in the region, right, until the 80s, until the sanctions. Instead, the nature of the regime itself, with an elite that was brought from outside, completely disconnected from the everyday life or the ordinary Iraqi, it is a self-serving, conservative, sectarian elite that really benefited from the violence to build a system of nepotism around parties and militias. And I show in the book really in great details what does this mean for women, gender, and feminist activists. It means so much challenge in just trying to preserve what is left of the so-called rights, such as the personal status code. So this is a picture in Sahat al-Firdaus, and I'm sure you're familiar with this Saha because this is where the statue of Saddam, so I'm sure now you have the picture, and you can see that nothing, there is no replacement, right? And this is a gathering of Rabitat al-Mar'a al-Iraqiyya, and it was around the March 8th. And the mobilization was around, and actually the very first demonstration of the civil society that was organized in post-2003 Iraq was a women's protest, a feminist protest. Because one of the first things that the new political elite dominated by Kurdish nationalists and Shia Islamists did when they arrived after the occupation or with the occupation is to demand the abolition of the personal status codes and its replacement by with a communal personal status code, a sectarian-based personal status code, right? So since 2003, feminist activists have been very vocal in trying to push against this attempt. And really, it shows how much post-2003 is not only sectarian, it is, to use the term coined by my friend and colleague Maya Mikdashi, it is sextarian in the sense that it is about sectarianism, but it is very much so about gender difference, right, and sexual difference. So women activists have been really working on so many aspects, not only in trying to preserve their rights, just to preserve the very existence of a personal status quo that is conservative, but that at least exists, right? But also for pushing for more legal rights. The latest kind of attempt made by Shia Islamist political parties in power is to keep the personal status quo as it is, but to add to it a personal status code based on the Ja'fari law, which is the main Shia madhab in Iraq. And what it meant is that, I mean, as part of the Ja'fari law, for example, Sin al-Balagha is, so the age of maturity for marriage for girls is 9 years old, whereas the legal age of marriage in the personal status code is 18 years old. There's also the possibility to legalize what we call bil-Iraq zawaj al-sayyid. So, unions contracted outside of the courts, and all kinds of precarious forms of marriages, among so many other things. So feminists in Iraq have been mobilizing, I mean, really, 2003, 2010, 2014. I think there isn't a year in Iraq where one of the main political parties is not trying to push for the sectarianization of the personal status code. Feminist activists have been also working on adopting a law sanctioning domestic violence and many other legal rights aspects. But what I show as well in my research is that women activists really not only work at the legal level, but they worked, and I would say so for many civil society and social organizations in Iraq, they work of substitute of the lack of state institution, really at every level of society, from helping families to access running water and electricity to the fight for welfare allocation, for example, for widows. Along this, and because of the nature of the state, which has been pretty much destroyed after the invasion, the only source of funding that women activists can access to are international sources of funding, so that are project-oriented. So just like it is the case in the region, there is a very strong NGOization of women's activism going on in Iraq. Really, the networks of funding shape the agenda, the action, and the initiatives of women's rights activists. So I have a chapter that is dedicated to Kurdish feminist activism, and it relies on my fieldwork in Iraqi Kurdistan. I won't talk about it too much, but if you are curious about it, I'm happy to talk about it in the Q&A. But I guess, Iraqi Kurdistan has been autonomous from the rest of Iraq since the 90s, and the process of NGOization of feminist activism has really reached a very advanced level there. And so finally, in my final chapter, I delve into the core of my questions: what are the different forms of feminisms in Iraq today? And I explore Iraqi women activists and feminist definition of gender norms and relations in an analytical framework relating the personal to the political. And I propose to reflect on very tough issues, because I think it's really tough to provide kind of a feminist reflection on issues such as conservatism, piety, morality, respectability. So I look at the ways in which Iraqi women activists define respectability, womanhood in relation to their lives and struggle. So these are just pictures of recent protests, because now I think it is time to relate. There are, of course, less NGOs and more NGOs, women's groups and feminist organizations in Iraq. This is, for example, a picture. So one of my arguments at the end of the book because I finished the book by the end of 2017, is that the movement of protest that started, I mean, we had protests since 2009, but really the very first strong movement of protest that we had that was really generalized started in 2015. And one of the arguments that I'm making is that this movement of protest really pushed women activists, many women activists, to develop forms of advocacy and activism outside of the NGOI's frame of women's rights. And this is a picture of, I mean, you can see very famous feminist leaders such as Hana Edouard, for example, Hana Hamoud, Emel Legbashi. And it's when activists were holding tents in front of the Green Zone in March 2016. So really feminists participated to this movement of protest. And so I conducted fieldwork, so I extended my research in 2015, 16 to the protest movement and its relationship to feminist activism. And I also conducted fieldwork more recently in Al-Basra. And so this is kind of the iconic picture of the protest in Al-Basra in 2018. But I can say that what we are experiencing today since October is really a revolutionary uprising that is unprecedented in its inclusivity and in the depths in which it reaches all parts of society across age, class, and gender under a main slogan that probably some of you know, "Nrid Watan," we want a country or we want a homeland. And it is led by youth who carry a very different political imaginary than the one of the previous generation. It is really an attempt to reverse the post-2003, perhaps the post-1991 political process and beyond. It is very much a societal uprising, challenging social and political hierarchy and conservative religious norms, gender norms. It demands the redistribution of Iraq's rich resources to the benefit of the poor, to build electricity, water, health, and housing infrastructures, as well as all type of state institutions and services, and very importantly, the end of the rule of the militias. So these guys are the heroes of the uprising, the tuk-tuk drivers. And clearly the ones who led the uprising and are still leading it are the street merchants, the one who are paid $6 a day as waiters, the one who carry heavy boxes in the street markets, the tuk-tuk drivers that really are still the heroes of the revolution. They carry the wounded activists to the hospital. They drive the protesters from one point to another to cross the roadblocks. And very importantly, and I noticed it even more in my last fieldwork in Tahrir Square less than a month ago, the uprising is really composed of many of the young men who actually fought Daesh in Mosul and came back after the fight. They came back to poverty. They came back to the same poverty that they left, basically. And they chose of peaceful protest is very remarkable. So it's what we call Jil el-Bobji, from the 15 years old to the 22 years old. So really a new generation. And then they were quickly joined by a large segment of the population, the middle class, the school and university students. We have every Sunday the university students protest all over the country. And of course the professional and workers' unions. And there is a general movement of strike and civil disobedience to the curfew imposed by the authorities followed all over the country. And while this uprising was made possible, of course, by the development of very strong civil society organizing, women and unions organizing in the last decade or even more, I think it also breaks with formal modes of organizing. But as you probably know, this uprising, I mean, we have a hyper-militarized state. And regime, I would say, although it's very complicated to talk about a regime when it comes to post-2003 Iraq. And this uprising, this peaceful uprising, has been met with violence, and more than 700, and I think that these numbers have been crossed a while ago, have been killed, and more than 25,000 injured. More than half of them severely injured, hundreds arrested, including many that have disappeared. But despite the repression they face, protesters have created really their miniature society in Tahrir Square, in Baghdad, in Saht al-Haboubi bin Nasriya, and all over the country. And they are really developing original ways to express an inclusive sense of belonging and proposing creative modes of sociability that transgress social and political hierarchies. And they are creating new state forms on the square, providing for free, this is Jebel Uhud, or the Turkish restaurant, the headquarters of the uprising. They propose, free services. They're really, protesters are really experiencing the society and proposing the society that they are fighting for. And really, I would say that women's involvement, young women's involvement, really makes this uprising a revolution. Because Tahrir is, I started describing the space, the militarization of the space, the fact that the space is really male-dominated, etc. And Tahrir and all the squares all over the country are new spaces for women in all shape or forms to exist and assert their existence. So really being physically present despite this incredible repression, and the authorities and the counter-revolutionary forces, the militias, are specifically targeting and threatening women in many, many ways. Just a week ago, a women's demonstration was organized to support the protests. It was called Banatak Ya Watan. And actually to try to sabotage this Banatak Ya Watan movement, there was another hashtag on social media that perhaps some of you have seen, which was Ahiratak Ya Watan. And I was actually one of the person tagged in some of the hashtags, and I was pretty happy to say that if it's the case, I'm a very proud Ahira. So as you can see, the backlash is very violent, but the mobilization is strong as ever. And I'll stop here.
Thank you, Zahra, for that fantastic talk. We are moving into the question and answer period. We're going to do, I think, the 3-question approach. Take 3, come back to you for some brief answers, and go back. We have about an hour or so for Q&As. So I will start on this side. I will just exercise my moderator's prerogative for 1 second and ask the first one, which is you make this point about historical memory and post-1991 being a reference point, which I think maybe is the first time I've kind of heard someone saying kind of this revolution is almost a response to post-1991. At the same time, the revolution is being led by a generation that, for the most part, have been born after 2003, who's, don't have a reference point to the sanctions period, the former regime. And so I wonder, how do you deal with that? I wouldn't call it a contradiction, but I wonder how you think about those two realities existing in conversation with, if you could maybe comment on that. I'll go to Rami first, and then, yes, go ahead, Rami.
Thank you very much, Zahra. I've been doing some work trying to just talk to activists and people in Algeria, Sudan, Lebanon, and Iraq for some work that I'm writing, journalistic work, not the kind of primary research you do, but I'm incredibly impressed by the amount of interaction that's going on between activists in these 4 countries. And I was interested to hear your views about how you understand how the Iraqi activists, women, men, students, whoever, have been, if they have been impacted by what happened, say, in Sudan and in Lebanon, and are there direct links, communications between them?
Thank you so much, Zahra, for this really very interesting talk, and you give us a lot of appetite to read your book. Yeah, so it's a pleasure. Well, I noticed that you didn't really mention the Islamic feminism. And the reason I evoking them in the region that, in fact, more and more I'm convinced that we need to accommodate what we called legal pluralism. If we accommodate legal pluralism, and this is an issue, it's a tough issue all over the world. I mean, in the United States, with some Christian sect, and we discovered recently that in France you have a Jewish court. It's not only a Sharia court, the famous one in Europe. So somehow we need to accommodate certain legal pluralism, but in the same time to control the content of this pluralism. It means that if you agree with me, it means that the issue in Iraq today, for instance, is not whether it will be a communal tribunal or not, but the content is whether early marriage should be allowed by the state or not. So, and here, I think this issue would differentiate between what you call leftist feminism from Islamic feminism, that they are not really very interested in challenging the raison d'être of the personal status, etc. And my second, briefly, question is about Jewish community in Iraq. Historically, in the 60s, 70s, were very active in the communist parties, etc. So I saw many things. I read many things about them. But the question of women was not clear. What is their role on that? Is there any role? Yeah.
I will take one more, actually, if there's one. Or yes, sorry. Two is, I mean, you have to organize it, so I'll give you that one.
Thank you so much, Zahra. So my first question is theoretical. You mentioned your intervention in post-colonial scholarship on women here, moving from the focus on the discursive to the material. I wonder if you and how you've engaged with the key question of agency and how it's been problematized, specifically with the secular religious binary. Yeah. So did you engage in that debate, and where did you come out? And because this is what the book's about, right? Women's agency. The second question is about the generational aspect. So you used women and feminist, and you seem to be using them interchangeably. So I was wondering if this is actually the case, or if there is a difference in how they're used, and if that has a generational valence or dimension. And if so, I mean, generationally speaking, from the late 50s to today, did you see a shift in the kinds of politics and issues that women have been fighting for? A movement for maybe political rights to more, bodily rights or sexuality or other issues. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much for the great question. So about the post, when I say the post 91 is because I think that the process that we have been experiencing really started before, and I really focus on the very destruction of the states. And this is
again, part of this argument that I'm making around structural violence, right? So even if you have the most amazing legal rights, if you don't have a good education system, a good healthcare system, if you don't have like strong institutions and services to make basically everyday life work, what are you going to do with these rights? And this is kind of the argument I'm making, and I'll go back to that on agency. So what I'm saying is that so I don't think at all that the activists formulate and read Watan as we want to go back to pre-91 at all, because like you said, it's Jil al-Bobji, they're very young, like post-2000s and or late 90s, and it's actually interesting just to mention that, so when I conducted fieldwork in the former protest movement, the activists were older, were more, university students, professional, teachers, whereas this uprising is really led by a generation that has no memory of Saddam Hussein, that has only a memory of the sectarian war, of Daesh invasion, of living in a place where there are no services, no institution, and that is a country that is led by a very conservative and sectarian Islamist political forces. So really the uprising is built in reaction to that, and to recall the first slogan, the slogan of the former uprising was Bismiddin Bagon al-Haramiyya, in the name of religion we were robbed by looters, right? So this is very clear. And then in al-Basra, it moved to Kalla Kalla lil Ahzab, and actually al-Basra really moved to a more radicalized forms of activism because he was also following the co-optation of the former uprising by an alliance made between the Sadrists and the communists. And so when the Basra protest emerged, it was really refusing any kind of relationship to any formal political group. And then now we have even a younger generation. I mean, most of the people I've interviewed in Tahrir have heard of what happened in 2015 and 16. Some, of course, Bel-Basra participated to Al-Basra, but really now is the first full engagement into a movement. There's very few study. I mean, there's, for example, the work of Marcin al-Shemmari, our common friend, who wrote an article that would sound pretty shocking, but that is very realistic, on young people in their 20s expressing a form of Saddam's nostalgia in Iraq. And it's not that they're nostalgic of something they know, it's not that they're nostalgic of authoritarianism, but they're nostalgic of just a functioning country, a country that seemed, from what their parents used to say, to function, and a country where your everyday life is not marked by militia violence and all types of violence. And I guess it also follows what Iraqis are feeling. You know, before we had one Saddam, and now we have a Saddam at every corner of the street. Before Bzemen Saddam, we knew, I mean, you can of course be killed in the worst manner, but in a way you kind of knew how to avoid being targeted, whereas now you can be killed for so many reasons, because of conflicts between tribes, because of just mentioning the name of a militia in one of your tweets or in one of a Facebook posts. So this is really, I think, what is going on in the new generation. And it's also very, so to reach to your question, connected with the outside world, we will never write enough about how the post-2003 period, first of all, is the period of the end of the sanctions. So this is very important, is the possibility of the rise of a middle class that was inexistent, impossible under the sanction. And secondly, and this middle class was really central, I think, in the former uprising. And secondly, it's also the opening of the youth and everyone to the internet and television and the channels that people were deprived of, right? So yes, you have I guess, a youth, and this is the case transnationally, right? That is more connected to the outside world.
I would say that in terms of the other uprisings that happened, probably the one in Lebanon was the most impactful in Iraq. Also, the kind of small protests that were going on in Iran were followed very meticulously by Iraqis. But I think that if there is one uprising that Iraqis feel the most close to, is really the Lebanese revolution. So in terms of your question, Sari, on Islamic feminism, so it's interesting because, you know, my background before starting this research, my background was actually to write on Islamic feminism, and I published a book on the question. And I really moved a little bit, I mean, analytically as well, theoretically from it, because I felt that this category doesn't always mean something sociologically, right? So it means a lot conceptually. People like to theorize around that because they like to see, oh, there are Christian feminists and there are Muslim feminists, you know, like they like the category. And I think it's really fun to theorize around that. And because also, I mean, I guess when you talk about Islamic feminism, you can also fall into reverse Orientalism in the sense that because it's Muslim majority countries, then we need an Islamic feminist. So I was self-critical of my own initial work because I found Islamic feminism very important at a certain time. And then when I really conducted, or maybe I would say that in terms of perhaps countries such as Europe or Northern America, it's in Muslim communities, the category means something in the sense that you have a context of Islamophobia, so developing forms of feminism, or showing basically that there are forms of feminism that don't fall into Western, and that people can articulate faith, and they can develop forms of women's rights activism in the frame of religion. But my fieldwork in Iraq, I haven't conducted fieldwork that in-depth in other places, is that, well, in a way, Islamic feminists, and so in the final chapter, I talk about different feminists, and I say that they all intertwine. I talk about the kind of human rights feminists, I talk about the Muslim feminists, I talk about the leftist feminists, and then I also talk about the Islamist feminists, which is of course upsetting for many people. But I really think it is important to actually acknowledge these different forms of advocacy, of engaging with women's rights in different ways. However, if you look at it sociologically, you will understand that, well, in some ways, certain women activists who are pious themselves, but who would not define themselves as Islamists or even Muslim feminists, would use kind of the religious repertoire. That's for sure, that exists. However, there's also a kind of a strategical use of this repertoire because of the personal status code, and because the status code rely on religious jurisprudence, right? And I think that because of this attempt to sectarianize the personal status code, if we have, even if we have like a strong trend of Muslim feminism in Iraq, it would have to deal with the sectarian differences. So how do we agree on, you know, المذهب الجعفري or the madhahib? So I mean, I talk about some Muslim feminists, some pious women rereading the sacred text and using this repertoire. But really, if you look at the movement itself, I don't think it occupies a lot of space, right? And it's not considered as so important in a context where you have very conservative and sectarian Islamists in power, right? So in this context, the kind of reaction would be to contest religion itself, right? Not by everyone, but I think it's a very strong trend nowadays in Iraq. And I also would say that historically, if you look at the mobilization around religion and the religious kind of corpus in the region, it's mostly nationalist feminists who mobilized it because they always perceived that religion is part of the so-called authentic culture, right? So the use of Islam as, and the very establishment of the personal status code is the result of that. It's kind of the negotiation, and we are like it's al-hadatha, but it's a hadatha that is authentic to the culture. And of course, the only thing that will make this hadatha and this authentic is to keep women's rights in the field of religion, right? Whereas in the context of Iraq, communist feminists have always tried to stay away from these debates. But I talk as well, so for example, in Iraqi Kurdistan, I talk about an Islamist feminist, so a woman who is a Kurdish a feminist activist, member of one of the, an important Islamist party, and she's really articulating what I would call a very radical Muslim feminist, and she's kind of the only one who would actually tackle issues of family, because the rest of the feminists would, and that reaches your question, would actually stay away from tackling rights outside of, inside the family, and they would stay more in emphasizing about political rights, in the public sphere. But there is, let's say, the main organization that would tackle these issues of sexuality and homophobia would be an organization that is not very NGOized, actually, which is the Organization of Women's Freedom in Iraq. And there are debates among youth, also non-organized women around these issues, but these issues are, I mean, feminists are being very careful around these topics, because you have to remember that in a situation where militias really rule. I mean, when I was conducting fieldwork, and until I think now, some organizations don't even put the name of the organization in front of their offices because they're scared of being attacked by militias. And I also discuss a lot these different strategies. And how do you make a difference between what is strategical in a context of lack of security and really dominant conservatism, and what is really part of the main agenda? And I think that most of the time, and in so many contexts, there's no difference. Right? I mean, the feminist advocacy, the vocabularies, are all always connected with the concrete context in which women live. So I don't know if that really answers most of the questions. Oh, about the Jews in Iraq. I mean, the Jews, I mean, the Jewish Iraqis, most of them left Iraq in the late 40s and early 50s. And it's actually in the 40s and 50s that they played, and in the 30s very much, that they played a very important role in leftist activism and the communist parties, but less in the 60s because there were a very little number.
Great, thank you. Second set of questions. I would also encourage the students in the room to ask. Yes, great. So I'll start here. If you could also introduce yourself, that'd be great.
Transnational sense, at least across the Levant, and maybe then in the 70s when the Ba'ath took over, whether there were any connections between feminists in Syria and Iraq. Thank you.
Right there.
Hello. First, thank you for your talk. My name is Nadia. My question has to do with the construction and entrenchment of gendered sectarian identities, but through a more comparative perspective with Lebanon, specifically looking at the question of institutionalization, because it came very early on in the conception of the Lebanese state, going even to the late 19th century. With it came in more recently in 2000 2003 where it became really institutionalized. So how do you think this makes a difference specifically because in Lebanon it was also, there's the context of the civil war, whereas in Iraq it was more about an invasion. So if you can speak a little bit about that. Thank you.
And I think there was one more hand here, yeah.
Hello, thank you so much, Zahra, for your talk. My name is Rafi, and I'm a communication and media student here at UB. It's very interesting when you mentioned the hashtag that was used, the Ahirat Baladna, and because the same thing happened in Algeria when the feminist movement arose. The same thing happened. They were looked at as Ahirat, unfortunately. My question is about a phrase you mentioned in your introduction, quote unquote, Islamization of feminists and feminization of Islamist women. Do you think that happened organically, or was there agency involved in that? Thank you.
And you got some tough students, good God. All right.
All right, so yes, I wish I could live in the 50s and 60s and 70s because everything was so transnational, right? There was such a beautiful period in this world. The older activist I interviewed, Allah yarhamha, she passed away 2 years ago. And she was 78 years old when I interviewed her. And she was one of these women, she told me the whole story. I mean, she was also pretty young, but she remembered the establishment of the personal status code. She and other older activists told me about the experience of going to Berlin, going to Morocco, going to Cairo, going all over the world, and how much feminist activism was related. In the 70s, there was even a demonstration in support of Angela Davis, for example, in Baghdad, right? Yes, it was very much transnational, and that was, I think, part of what were nationalist movement, anti-imperialist movement at the time, and leftist movement as well. So it was in connection to that, I think. Yes, it's very. I agree with you very much that because our sectarian attempt came with the U.S. invasion and occupation, and the regime that came with this invasion. It didn't manage to impose itself. And actually, there is one kind of poll that was done by a woman organization, an Islamist woman organization actually, about the attempt to adopt a Shia-based or Ja'fari-based personal status code, and most of the Shia population was against it. So really the only ones who use it to assert their power, who use it in the frame of al-Madlumiyya, Shi'iyya, who use it really as symbolic of Shia identity and how it is definitely played on women and gender issues, are the Shia Islamists in power. And among feminists actually, it's only Shia Islamist women who supported and who still supports the sectarianization of the personal status code. All the feminist activists insist on, and all the Shia women insist on keeping one code for Sunnah and Shias. So the Islamization of feminism, and so this is actually a term that was used by Zakiya Salim in the context of Morocco that I use in the book. Because one of the things that I say is that there was an emerging literature in, let's say in this, up to the kind of 70s, 80s, all the literature on feminist movement in the region was focused on secular feminists. And then in the 90s, people started to study religious-based or Islamist forms of women activists. But there isn't still really a literature that try to look at both in relation to each other. And this is what I'm trying to do. And again, with this kind of personal, political, structural, and political. So when you are in a context where you are the ones who are ruling you are conservative Islamists, your relationship to religion as a political tool is, of course, different than when you are, of course, dominated by a secular party, right? So I really insist on the contextualization of feminism. So the secular and the Islamist, these categories really have to be read in connection to what's the power dynamics going on, right?
Thank you. Other questions? Another set? We'll do maybe Nadia in the back and a couple more. Nadia, please.
Thank you, Zahra. So my question is actually if you could speak to the kind of awareness that these women activists and feminists have of being part of a historical continuum themselves. Right? Do they situate themselves as knowing that they are part of the next stage of a legacy of feminist activism, of women's activism, or is it compartmentalized by generation, by historical phase, by invasion? Like how much connectivity are they aware of having themselves, or do they feel like that they have to constantly reinvent the wheel every time they take to the streets? But I think that's also an issue here.
Yeah. I mean, I love this question because it allows me to also really emphasize on the complexity of the Iraqi society. Of course, all societies are complex, but you know, in Iraq it's very common, and it's the case in my household, I'm sure it's the case in your household, to have a communist father and an Islamist mother, a communist brother and an Islamist sister, right? And this is very important, I think, in talking about legacies. So I don't think that there is a very strong awareness of clear legacies. We have very few books written on it. We have very few resources on the matter. However, there are, and this is part as well of a wider debate, because after 2003 there are different and competing imaginaries, right? Until today, بالعراق, يعني some people call 2003 التحرير, other الاحتلال, and we have to acknowledge this diversity of experience, right? So what I want to say is that there are figures that emerge. So for example, of course the Islamists would use, for example, the Shia Islamists بالعراق invented an alternative International Women's Day, which is ولادة الزهراء. And so I'm sure it also exists in other contexts, for sure. So of course every kind of political group bring its own imaginary. However, there are certain things that are shared, and I could, for example, I mentioned Naziha al-Dalaimi. You can have, who was a feminist, and if you read her book that she published, I think in '52. So really a while ago, she talks about issues of actually sexuality. She tackles issues of body freedom in ways that are way more radical than feminists could address today. However, Naziha al-Dalaimi, because she is part of this national kind of memory, can be used by very hardcore conservative Islamists. As احنا كان عندنا نزيه الدليمي, you know, so that's very interesting. But it also speaks to the diversity existing within, you know, Iraqi households in terms of political affiliation, and also it shows how much history and legacies is really fabricated, right, in the everyday. As well, you have a lot of communists who has, of course, because communist activism has been so repressed and has a history of repression and of violence that is shared with the Shia Islamists and Kurdish nationalists who were also repressed by the Ba'ath regime. So, for example, Bint al-Huda is أخت شهيد الصدر, is really a figure for many, I mean, extremely secular woman activists who would quote her and talk about her as a resistant to authoritarianism, right? So I wouldn't say that they are clear. I mean, the ones who are clear, I would say, are the ones who have a clear political project, who are the Shia Islamists. However, at the individual level, I would say, and even at the level of the activists, things are very intertwined. right? This is why I think categorization is very important, but really when you spend time with people and when you live in a society that has been experiencing as that much, you know, traumas and kind of breaks, radical breaks in a very small amount of time, you really realize that there's so many imaginaries pre-existing at the same time.
I think there was a question in the corner, I think. So I'll take that one, and then I'll take one more on the side. I think there's, oh, two more here. Okay, so I'll start there, please.
Thank you. It's a great one. So, my name is Leah. I'm a journalist. Thanks for your talk. Very interesting. I was wondering, how did those women you interviewed, I guess it was plenty, but how did they react to being approached for an interview at all? And, you know, to becoming subject of like a study? Was there a difference between the older ones, the younger ones?
One over here, and then one here. Oh, sorry. Let me start here. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you very much for a very interesting talk. So beyond contextualization, how did you see and how the women you have interviewed see instrumentalization of women issues to advance certain political and political economic agendas, particularly imperial ones? Do they realize that in a way that sometimes because when you talk about the Kamel Irani of Don Saddam, it's clear that you use women.
Yes.
In the simplest way. Post 2003 with the Americans, the quota clearly used. So.
One more.
I just wanted to ask you that the figure of Nazif in America would not really abandon.
Of course, yeah, definitely. Yes.
She could represent them all.
Yes, yeah.
And I wanted to mention, I work on Islamic feminism in the Arab world, and in the beginning, you know, that the first initiatives like Fadl al-Manisi and Layla Ahmed, and they were Muslims and feminists, and it's enough. But now we have some that will call themselves maybe secular, but they are working on Islamic feminists, and some they are reformers, and some they are they do interpretation. That means, in a sense, they work to interpret the text, not to conform with the text. So we have. I mean, if you want to later on to discuss it with you.
Sure.
I'm sorry, I missed your talk. I couldn't come back.
Sure.
Go ahead.
So the question about the interviews, I mean, so most women I asked for an interview were very, very happy and open, and it was. I think if you think about it, also as ethnographers, in a way, in a lifetime, you don't have a lot of opportunity to narrate your whole life to another human being that you barely know. And people really take the opportunity to do it. So I've never had someone who cancelled an interview, or people were really willing to talk, willing to share. They actually wanted me to, of course, provide their name, which I didn't, because I told them it's for ethical reasons, for many reasons. It's anonymized. So when I actually gave to some of them the book, I told them their real name in the book so that they know. So on the contrary, when I started fieldwork, really, I mean, it's really recently that people are starting to do fieldwork in Iraq. When I started, there was literally nobody, right? And people who really felt, and it was really still the middle of the sectarian war, and people really felt in an enormous prison of T walls, right? So they really took this opportunity to tell their story, and when I said that I'm working in English, I mean it's going to be published in English, they were even more eager to share, because they felt that it's going to be shared in the outside world. I had only one experience of a woman who got scared, and it was really at the start of my field work when people didn't know me. You know, there's a kind of it takes some time to build confidence, etc. And it was a woman, very old communist woman, who was tortured under Saddam. So for sure, there is. So the interview itself is kind of okay. Now, recording the interview, of course, the older the women were, the more tricky it was. For the younger generation, there was no issue with recording, but with the older, it could definitely raise some concern.
So thank you for this question about imperialism. It is, I'm sure, but perhaps my answer won't please anyone, but I don't think I'm here to please. When I started my fieldwork, that was kind of my question as well. I was, coming from outside, from the diaspora, starting fieldwork بالعراق, and I was all about America, ودمرونا, and really when you arrive there and you realize that it is not a very central concern for women, it is not a central point of advocacy. There are certain organizations who articulate it, who would talk about, anti-imperialists, but I think that they are considered old school, and I mean, most of the feminist activists would, and it is something that is showed also very clearly, for example, in the protest, right, is that it also addressed kind of everyday needs, right, and what they have in front of us is a state or government that is not fulfilling its task, right? So if you talk about imperialism, for example, but I'll talk about that as well. But if you talk about imperialism, if we bring up this register in Tahrir Square, people would be like, what does America has to do with the fact that there's no more than 6 hours of electricity in Iraq, right? So and like politically, I think they do as well, of course, and this is why I bring the broader historical context. But what I'm saying is that really it is not something that is very kind of popular. It is not a register that is widely used. There are certain traditional leftist organizations such as the Iraqi Communist Party, but the main activist, Hana Edwar, for example, who is a figure of the Iraqi Communist Party, and she's a figure of Shabakat al-Nisa al-Iraqiyat, she would say that the fight against imperialism is not something that she would actually use in her advocacy, right? So I'm absolutely not saying that I agree, but what I'm saying is that it is definitely not a central political demand that is developed by activists on the ground. Yes, I agree.
Nobody canceled an interview with you in Baghdad?
No, never.
Who are you? I don't know how that happens. You're the Bumburi, لا.
Yeah, that's very true. Yes. Yeah, for sure. I mean, social media, like it was the case, I guess, in other uprisings, so pages, for example, on Facebook, I use. So for the activists now in Tahrir Square, if they want to give you a concrete example, if activists in Tahrir Square right now want to organize an initiative or an action, what will happen is that they will go to every single tent, right? And they will ask every single kind of tent what if they agree, what are the points they want to emphasize, and then they would basically hang this is really direct democracy. They would basically hang the proposed initiative or action on Al-Uhud, on this building, right? It will be hanged. So you can. Any public declaration that is made in Tahrir Square is hanged here, right? And then they would agree with, they would have something like 25 pages on Facebook that are run by different activists, and they would agree to actually send this specific action in 25 pages on Facebook and on Twitter,
Right. So that's just an example of how concretely really social media is very central in organizing, in spreading the word about an action. And there are also certain shows, I mean, certain personalities that emerge. Of course, some people would mention Ahmed al-Bashir, for example, and I think his influence on the younger generation is I could definitely, I mean, confirm that on the ground, that his shows are followed by young people and his ideas are really spread across the country.
News outlets and stuff, do you feel like they give the correct representation of the movements and the feminism and everything that goes on in our world?
So you're talking about local news or outside of Iraq?
Local news more specifically?
So no, absolutely not. I mean, apart from a few channels that are well known to be channels that oppose the post-2003 regime, not at all. If you look at Qanat al-Iraqiyya, it's like nothing is happening in Iraq. We have musalsalat from like the 70s, from Zaman Saddam on at 5, when like you have, I don't know how, like a certain number of people who had just been, for example, killed, right? So it's as bad as that. And also in Iraq, many local channels are run by militia members, right? Or people who are close or members of the political elites. So you have something like perhaps 15 channels that are run by some of these people. So there are, I think the covering of the protest is really happening through social media, is not through the news.
I think we can take 2 more. There are 2 more questions. One in the back.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the interesting talk. You already talked briefly about the connection
To an exchange with Iranian protesters and activists, but also before the very recent protests in 2019 and 2020, were like, how would you describe the connection or exchange with Iranian feminist activists?
So you want to take another question?
If there is one, please go ahead, and then we'll wrap up.
Thank you, Zahra. It was a great talk. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel that, especially in the last week or 2, with the question of the segregation of space and women in protests by the Sadrists, I feel that the question of women has moved from being, in 2015, more of a question on the periphery or an addition of other questions, to now becoming really at the core of the political, and really the intersectionality of the different systems of oppression. And it's all of a sudden become very clear how gender is at the core of our everyday and politics, and I feel that it has shifted something in how politically the Sadrist movement is also being dealt with. So I'd like to know what you think.
Yes, so regarding Iran, no, I don't think that there are very strong relationship between feminists in Iran and feminists in Iraq. I don't think so. And I think Iraqi feminists very often say that they feel very isolated and not understood when they travel or when they do many. I think there have been many meetings, for example, in Beirut, but I don't think that there is today, especially if we compare it to what we talked about in the 60s and 70s, really the feminist movements are not very transnational. But now, when it comes to the protests themselves, Iraqis are very, very interested in what's going to happen, or if anything, happen in terms of protests in Iran, because they feel that the destiny of Iraq is very much related to Iran and to the regime. So, very interesting question, Rima. Actually, I would say that in the previous protest, women and feminist activists, organized feminist activists, participated to the different protest movements. But this time, I don't think it is actually the case. I think that what put women at the core is the involvement of young women who are not organized in any form of organization. And it's very interesting because recently I interviewed somebody that I've been following for so many years and who is almost every day in Tahrir. And she almost expresses a distance from her organization, which is one of the main feminist organizations in Iraq, and says, no, I'm here as an individual to support our sons, أولادنا, أو الولد, right? So there is this idea that خلاص احنا المنظمات we tired of anything organized, and even the people, like even the ones who are organized are defining themselves as the people, right? So for me the move really relates to the massive involvement of young women. This really changed everything, and it imposed like women's demand, women's related things, let's say, as very central for the protesters. And perhaps it's also, I think now I realize that I forgot part of your question. Yes. So I start the book with a very kind of simple definition of feminism. I don't want to provide any very defined definition because my research talks very much about the need to contextualize. So if we consider that feminism is to do anything good for women, it could be at the social level, it could be at the political level, it could be at the economic level, then you really have a wide definition of feminism. And there are different terms that I use in Iraq. Here, actually, I'm very curious. When we say ناشطة نسوية, it can mean a woman activist بالعراقي, but it can also mean a feminist activist. So there is an ambiguity of the term itself that allows you to and when you get the reaction of the person, then you understand in the spectrum of how the different ways feminism is deployed, where this person is situated, right? There is very recently some activists have started to use the word el-feministiya, but this is extremely recent. To say clearly this is feminism, I'm talking about feminism. Yes, because of the ambiguity. لأنه إذا تقولي ناشطة نسوية can mean a woman activist or it can mean a feminist activist بالعراقي. So ما أدري إذا يعني أنت لا إحنا we would never say ناشطة نسائية. We said ناشطة نسوية even if we right.
بس هذا النسائية بالقرن التاسع عشر ابن ناصر استعملت نسائيات يعني قديم مصطلح نسائية نستعمله النسوية العربية أو النسوية الإسلامية.
So I think we're going to wrap it up, and I'm going to put you on the spot, Zahra, with if you have a final kind of comments to make to close today, because we've put you on. I'm sorry.
Segregation of the term. Yeah, so you mean on the kind of utility to use or not? So if certain times we would say that it's better not to use the word feminism, but if the content is feminist is the most important, is it your question?
So does that make each form of feminism have another goal than other forms?
Yeah, it's a difficult question because I think that so it depends as well why you do it. If you do it because you consider that without the acknowledgement of the diversity existing, among us as feminists, then we can't address the different power relation between us. And I think this is the way the debate has been also put by a lot of intersectional feminists, in the sense that we need to define the differences in order to be able to actually cross them. If we pretend that there's no differences, there's no power relation, that there are no also tough topics, it would be really impossible for us to work together, right? But you know, in this case, in the way I categorize the difference, so I use in the book human rights feminists, Muslim feminists, leftist feminists, and Islamist feminists. You could actually have in the same organization these different types. So it's not a matter of organization, it's just a matter of maybe revealing also the diversity and the intertwinedness existing within the society that then will exist in an organization or in a network. Now with the term itself, I think that's it's kind of a difficult debate, and some women would say, or would rely on the ambiguity of the word nasawi to of course distinguish themselves from two radical forms that they would say, oh no, احنا مو مثل هذول. You know, there's always this horrible anti figure that a lot of conventional feminists would rely on, and I think that it's a debate that is not necessarily a debate of words, but is more about, okay, what are concretely on the ground the strategies we are using? Why, for example, a concrete example is women's shelters. So, for example, the Organization of Women's Freedom in Iraq is being sued by the government for having women's shelters because they are so illegal women's shelters. So they are the only shelters in Iraq. There's a huge debate around the possibility to actually have shelters. And I'm talking about not Iraqi Kurdistan, because in Iraqi Kurdistan the debate is different. But there's a huge debate around the legalization of shelters, because of course for conservatives of all, and on this, I mean, the reactions, for example, of Iraqi MPs came from the left, from the Islamists, that it's an attempt, it creates fitna in the society if you provide shelters for women victims of abuse, right? So the only organization that has done it since 2003 on its own, illegally in a way, is this organization. The rest of, and this is why I think it's important now for us to look at people who are not formally organized as well as, you know, new forms of feminism, because on this point, the rest of the feminist movement is actually against OFI and consider, for many, many reasons, that women's organization should not run shelters for women victims of abuse. Some would say it's because if we do that, it's there are gonna be so many problems. So we need to vote the law that, I mean, the picture that I showed you on the mobilization around the adoption of a law sanctioning domestic violence has this idea of shelter in it. So for a lot of feminists in Iraq, the idea is that we have to do it with the state, otherwise it won't work. And a lot of feminists themselves criticize OFI for opening these shelters illegally. So this is a question, for example, where there's so many things to discuss, right? So it's definitely, analytically, I see it as certain feminists wanting to be, or ally themselves with the state. Other feminists saying that no, feminist activism should be outside of the state. And this is because I've really done a specific fieldwork on this issue, because something very interesting happened in 2017, because for the first time in Iraq's history, we had wafd of feminists going to Al-Marja'iyya bin Najaf. So basically, how I analyze it is that we were so desperate that the state is corrupt and dysfunctional. We're not gonna obtain anything. So feminist activists really relied on Al-Marja'iyya to support their attempt to adopt a law sanctioning domestic violence. And I mean, it's been since 2010 that people, I mean, these organizations have been mobilizing, and until now we have obtained nothing at all. Despite a little bit of support of Al-Marja'iyya, until now it is still considered that it's against our culture, against our religion, against so many things. And on this, there is really no difference between the secular and the Islamists. You would have secular MPs that are as hardcore against the existence of a law sanctioning domestic violence than Islamists.
Right. So I just want to close really briefly with, again, a gratitude, thanks to the Women and Gender Studies program here at IFI, and most importantly to Zahra Ali for coming all the way from New Jersey and giving this wonderful and exhaustive talk and answering, so many questions so well. So thank you again. Much love to you, and give it up to Zahra.
Thank you. Ani mamnoona.